At 5:55 p.m. Tokyo time, on April 13, 1943, a radio operator at the Combined Fleet headquarters in Rabaul tapped a critical message into the dark Pacific night. The transmission was encrypted in JN-25D, the Imperial Japanese Navy's main operational cipher, and addressed to 3 separate commands in the Northern Solomons, specifically the commanders at Base Unit No. 1, the 11th Air Flotte, and the 26th Air Flotte. On the surface, it looked like routine paperwork. A senior officer was heading out to visit forward air bases. Every detail was laid bare. His departure time, his exact aircraft, and the precise number of fighter escorts. His arrival at each stop was timed to the minute. The man behind this message was Commander Yasuji Watanabe, a staff officer serving on the flagship under the legendary Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The itinerary he sent belonged to Yamamoto himself, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet and the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack. The leader American naval intelligence flagged in secret files as the most brilliant strategic mind in the Japanese military. Watanabe spelled out every single detail. Takeoff from Rabaul at 0600 on April 18th in one of 2 Betty bombers from the 705th Group, guarded by 6 fighters from the 204th Group, landing at Bali Airfield near Bougainville at 0800. Then, a quick boat crossing to Shortland Island at 0840, moving on to Bouin to inspect the very pilots who had just fought in the recent air campaign. Flying back to Rabaul at 1400, if the weather turned bad, the plan would slide by one day. Watanabe took 2 precautions. One would protect them, and the other was completely useless. He ordered the message sent strictly through the Imperial Navy's private channels, avoiding the Imperial Army's radio network, which Naval Command always looked down on as sloppy with code security. He had no idea, and would be horrified to learn later, that the Army ended up repeating the message over their own channels using a much weaker code. But, as you and I know, none of his security measures mattered. The Americans were already reading their secret codes. 1,700 miles to the east, inside the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific compound on the grounds of the 14th Naval District Headquarters at Pearl Harbor, the intercepted message arrived within hours. The unit, known as Station Hypo to the men working in its windowless basement, had cracked earlier Japanese codes in time to secure the legendary American victory at Midway back in June 1942. The newest version of this code, designated D by American cryptanalysts, used a brand new cipher book launched on April 1st, 1943. For 12 days, Codebreakers struggled to read the new system. Then, Yamamoto's travel plans landed on their desks. Just as they began piecing together fragments of coherent Japanese text, the unit's lead analyst, Marine Officer Alva Lasswell, started reading the broken, half-decrypted message. The puzzle came together through scattered words and decoded symbols. A departure time, a plane type, a fighter escort count, a detailed flight path mapped across the Northern Solomons, and a name that needed no explanation. Yamamoto. Lasswell is remembered by Commander Edwin Leighton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, in his 1985 memoir, recalling how Lasswell turned to his colleagues and announced, "We have hit the jackpot." Within just hours, Leighton had the translated text in hand and carried it across the Pearl Harbor compound straight to the office of Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief. The flight schedule that Commander Watanabe had drafted back in Rabaul, for standard distribution to his officers, had quickly become the most critical intercept of the entire Pacific War. If you enjoy exploring real historical records like this, please hit the like button. It helps us bypass the legends and share true history with those who care. Now, the cipher used for this secret dispatch was nothing new to the Americans, and its background is key to our story. Known as JN-25, it was a 5-digit military code used by the Japanese Navy since the late 1930s. Its foundation relied on a massive book of 33,000 distinct 5-digit groups. Each code stood for a specific word, military phrase, or number. But over that base layer, the Japanese layered an additive key, the secondary set of numbers that were mathematically added to the main code before broadcasting. In theory, this made the final message totally unbreakable unless you possessed both the codebook and the exact mathematical key. Every time the Japanese introduced a new key, American codebreakers were left in the dark, forced to painstakingly rebuild the key by tracking patterns in the wireless radio traffic, identifying routine message openings and repeating address groups, and the mathematical regularity that emerged when comparing massive volumes of intercepts. They called this clever technique stripping, and it worked because the underlying code groups stayed the same, even when the outer additive layer changed. The Americans weren't cracking these additives with brute computing power. Instead, they peeled them back by spotting the structural fingerprints of the hidden codebook. The Japanese believed their system was absolutely unbreakable. This total confidence rested on two self-reinforcing assumptions that no internal review ever dared to challenge. First was a mathematical belief. They thought the double layer of codebook plus additive put their messages far beyond any enemy's analytical reach, especially since additive books changed regularly. The second was cultural, and it ran even deeper. Tokyo's naval intelligence believed the Japanese language itself, with its multiple complex writing systems, its heavy contextual ambiguities, and its vast distance from Western traditions created an impenetrable barrier. They thought no foreign codebreaker could decode it, even if the math layer was stripped away. This second belief was by far the more dangerous one. It prevented the Navy from running real security tests, where their own analysts would try to crack the JN-25 cipher from the outside, a test that would have exposed its fatal flaws. Meanwhile, the Americans had quietly trained hundreds of expert linguists, translators, and traffic analysts specifically to beat both layers, fully knowing how much the enemy trusted this blind spot. They treated that blind trust as a massive strategic asset, protecting the secret of their code breaking with the same intense discipline they used to crack the messages in the first place. This brings us to the fatal inspection tour, which grew directly from an air offensive Admiral Yamamoto had personally directed. In the first 2 weeks of April 1943, they launched Operation IGO, a massive wave of airstrikes, sending hundreds of naval planes against Allied ships and runways across the Solomons and New Guinea. It was Yamamoto's grand attempt to stall the advancing American forces in the Solomon Islands by wiping out critical cargo ships, warplanes, and harbor bases to choke off their buildup at Guadalcanal and nearby Papua. Raids pounded targets from April 7th through April 14th, focusing heavily on ships around Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, and New Guinea. The returning Japanese pilots landed back at Rabaul with absolutely spectacular victory claims. They reported sinking dozens of Allied transports and battleships, claiming they destroyed scores of planes in dogfights and on runways. In reality, post-war Allied records revealed that the actual damage was only a tiny fraction of those wild claims. The Allies lost just one destroyer, a single tanker, a New Zealand corvette, and a few minor vessels. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot losses were devastatingly high and nearly impossible to replace. Yet, Yamamoto accepted these exaggerated reports as they climbed up through the chain of command. This habit of over-reporting victories was a chronic issue for Japanese aviation. In the chaos of dogfights, exhausted pilots constantly overcounted. Squadron commanders piled those numbers together. Then, higher-ranking officers passed these massive totals up to fleet headquarters without ever adjusting them down for a reality check. Yamamoto, once famous for his cold, realistic grasp on the grim mathematics of war, completely failed to question these reports in April 1943. Believing the inflated success stories, he decided to personally visit his forward bases. He wanted to congratulate his young pilots face to face for what he truly believed was a massive victory. His tour would cover forward airfields like Bougainville and Shortland, the very bases where those strikes had launched. The travel plans would take him directly through skies his staff assumed were completely safe, since they were protected by Japanese fighter cover based in Bougainville, and also because they believed the closest American fighter base on Guadalcanal was simply too far away for any hostile aircraft to reach them. That assumption was dead wrong, thanks to a single, deadly aircraft. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was a twin-engine, twin-boom interceptor that American forces had deployed to the Pacific Theater starting in late 1942. Japanese pilots easily recognized it on sight. Its unique twin-boom tail and central pod made it unmistakable, and they had faced it over Guadalcanal, the Aleutians, and the New Guinea coast. Imperial aviators had developed a healthy, weary respect for it. The Lightning was fast, climbed incredibly well, and packed heavy nose firepower with 4 50 caliber machine guns and a deadly 20mm cannon. But what Japanese intelligence completely overlooked was the fighter's incredible reach. This P-38 was designed from day one for long-range interception. Today, we look at how its twin Allison engines and internal fuel tanks gave it a combat range no single-engine American fighter in the Pacific could ever match. Armed with drop tanks, a P-38G could pull off a 1,000-mile round trip and still arrive with plenty of fuel for a fast, brutal dogfight. Its first Pacific combat came in August 1942, when 2 Lightnings from the 343rd Fighter Group sprang into action. Part of the 11th Air Force downed 2 Japanese Kawanishi flying boats near Kiska in the Aleutian Islands after a 1,000-mile patrol. This clash mattered far less for its immediate tactical payoff than for what it proved about the aircraft's incredible reach. A 1,000-mile mission was routine for a P-38, but completely impossible for a Wildcat. By April 1943, the Lightning was flying active combat patrols throughout the South Pacific, handling crucial escorts, intercepts, and sweeps that no other American fighter in the region could even try. Though Japanese intelligence tracked these deployments, they failed to update their range charts to account for what a P-38 could achieve with auxiliary fuel. Instead, their military commanders in the Solomons remained hyper-focused on the single-engine planes operating out of Henderson Field, specifically the F-4F Wildcat and the newer F-4U Corsair. Neither of those aircraft could fly to Bougainville and back. Staff officers plotting Yamamoto's tour through the northern Solomons treated the 400 miles between Henderson Field and Balail as a safe buffer zone. Had their intelligence factored in the P-38's long range with drop tanks, they surely would have adjusted his flight path. Yet, historical records show no one on Yamamoto's staff ever asked if an American twin-engine fighter could cover that massive distance. Others did raise alarms, though. Lieutenant General Hoshi Imamura, the senior Army commander in Rabaul, had narrowly escaped a deadly American air ambush just 1 month prior while traveling between bases. Imamura pleaded with Yamamoto to cancel the flight. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa offered to provide a much larger fighter escort than the 6 planes scheduled, but Yamamoto declined. Rear Admiral Takatsugu Jushima even flew to Rabaul to warn him, calling the radioed schedule a blatant invitation for an ambush. Yamamoto overruled every warning, determined to carry out his frontline morale-boosting mission. Visiting his frontline pilots was a solemn duty, and he was not a man to break his promises. He was also famous for being relentlessly punctual, a trait that would prove fatal. Commander Leighton heavily stressed this to Admiral Nimitz. If the decrypted intelligence said Yamamoto would land at Balale at 8 a.m., he would be there. The timeline in the message was no rough estimate. It was a strict schedule the combined fleet's commander would honor to the exact minute. It was an appointment the Americans could keep, too. Subscribe to follow this historic hunt as it unfolds. The entire plan relied on the fact that Yamamoto was completely irreplaceable to Japan's war effort. He was the only top Japanese commander who had actually lived and studied in America, studying at Harvard from 1919 to 1921 and working as a naval attaché in Washington in the late 1920s, witnessing American industrial power, factories, and massive oil infrastructure with his own eyes. He understood their manufacturing might in a way no other Japanese officer did. In 1940, long before Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto told his prime minister that if Japan forced a war with the United States, he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but had zero confidence in surviving a second or third year. This prophetic warning survived in political memoirs and was later detailed in the book The Reluctant Admiral, which was published in 1969 and translated into English a decade later. It remains the most realistic and chillingly accurate pre-war prediction of how the conflict would unfold, yet the man who foresaw it all was now flying directly into a trap laid by his own planners. Leighton assured Nimitz that any successor would be far weaker. Japan could never replace a brain like his. But Nimitz faced a brutal dilemma. Was eliminating Japan's finest strategist worth risking the secret that the U.S. had cracked their JN-25 code? If the enemy realized the strike was too perfect, they would know their systems were breached, promptly changing their ciphers and erasing the massive intelligence edge the Americans had relied on since Midway. That real-time code-breaking edge would vanish overnight. Hit like if you want more historical showdowns. Everything the Codebreakers at Pearl Harbor and Melbourne had built, the painstaking recovery of code groups, the reconstruction of additive tables, and the deep institutional knowledge of Japanese communications accumulated over years, would be lost. They would have to start from scratch. Losing that edge would mean more ships sunk, more planes lost, and months of brutal war dragged out. Admiral Nimitz weighed that heavy cost against the certainty of eliminating Yamamoto. His intelligence officer, Edwin Leighton, believed Tokyo would blame the ambush on something other than broken codes. Nimitz consulted Admiral William Halsey, the hard-charging commander of the South Pacific forces in Noumea. Halsey offered a fierce, unambiguous endorsement, a moment preserved in naval history logs and analyzed by modern historians. Armed with Halsey's full backing, Nimitz greenlit the high-stakes mission. The gamble was simple. Tokyo would find another explanation for the ambush, allowing American intelligence to keep reading their codes long after the admiral was gone. The chain of command ran from Nimitz to Halsey, then down to Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, leading air operations from Guadalcanal. Mitcher handed the target to Major John Mitchell of the 339th Fighter Squadron. Mitchell received his orders on April 17th. He had less than 24 hours to pull a plan together. He plotted a route that was a masterpiece of navigation, carefully designed to bypass Japanese radar networks and stay clear of any island coast watchers who might spot a massive swarm of American fighters heading north. He drew a jagged dog-leg route swinging far west over the open waters of the Solomon Sea. From there they would turn toward Bougainville, staying far outside the range of enemy spotters. The outward trip stretched 600 miles, flown just 30 to 50 feet above the waves, in total radio silence. Success rested entirely on a compass, a clock, and calculated airspeed. There would be no radio chatter, no landmarks over the open ocean, and no chance to correct a heading error that would place them in the wrong sky at the wrong minute. Each fighter carried 2 drop tanks, one 310-gallon and 165. Those massive tanks had been rushed in from MacArthur's Theater the previous night because Guadalcanal simply did not have the right size. 18 P-38s were assigned to the hunt. Mitchell led a cover force of 14 fighters, tasked with locking down the Japanese escort and keeping those Zeros away. A lethal 4-plane strike team was specifically charged with destroying the Betty bombers, crewed by Captain Thomas Lania Jr., Rex Barber, Besby Holmes, and Raymond Hine. On the morning of the flight, 2 of the fighters never made it airborne. One pilot blew out a tire on the harsh coral runway at Fighter 2. Another had failing drop tanks. Still, 16 P-38s soared into the sky at 7:25 on April 18, 1943. They hugged the waves and headed west out over the water. What followed was 2 hours of grueling, intense focus at an altitude that offered zero margin for engine trouble, navigation errors, or any lapse in concentration. Flying just 30 to 50 feet high, a split-second distraction meant slamming into the sea at over 200 miles per hour. They flew in a loose, staggered formation. Engines were throttled back to save fuel on the long journey, while pilots watched each other's aircraft for signs of failing drop tanks or rough-running engines. Mitchell's calculated headings demanded absolute, split-second precision at every single turn. Drift just 2 degrees over those 400 miles, and they would miss the target entirely. Over that blank ocean, they had no landmarks to check. They flew on pure faith, on Mitchell's precise math, and on the hope that Yamamoto was as obsessively punctual as they said. Mitchell's math pointed to an intercept right over Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville's western coast. His target time was 9:34. He arrived within 1 minute. At 9:34, the Americans spotted their targets exactly where the decrypted schedule said they would be. 2 Betty bombers were descending toward Balal at 4,500 feet, with 6 Zeros protecting them from above. The P-38s stayed low, their dark camouflage blending into the deep sea. Mitchell's flawless navigation over 400 miles of blank ocean had delivered 16 fighters to the intercept point, with a margin of error measured in seconds. Lania and Barber instantly punched off their fuel tanks, clawing upward into a steep turn toward the bombers. The escorting Zeros spotted the threat and scattered, some diving to fight the top cover, others swerving toward the attack team. These elite Japanese pilots were sworn to protect the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, and they knew exactly what was at stake. But they were outnumbered 6-16, facing Americans armed with absolute surprise and soaring speed from below, along with a four-plane element tasked only with targeting the bombers. The Japanese Zeros simply could not be everywhere at once. The clash that followed lasted barely 90 seconds, starting a mystery we are still untangling 8 decades later, though the final outcome is absolute. The lead Betty bomber, carrying Admiral Yamamoto, took heavy 50 caliber fire from behind and below. Its left engine began trailing heavy black smoke. The bomber rolled hard left, diving into the jungle canopy northwest of Bougainville. The second Betty bomber, carrying Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, the combined fleet's chief of staff, was struck in a separate attack and crash-landed in the ocean off Moore Point. Out of the 11 men aboard both bombers, Yamamoto and nearly everyone on the first plane died instantly or in the impact. Ugaki survived with critical injuries, pulled from the crashing surf alongside the pilot and another officer. The only American loss was Lieutenant Raymond Hine, whose P-38 fighter failed to return and was never found. The debate over who fired the fatal shots at Yamamoto's bomber sparked intense military controversy for decades to come. Landfire claimed the victory publicly until the day he died, while Barber fought the claim with equal determination. If we look at the modern consensus, supported by post-war testimony from Warrant Officer Kenji Yanagiya, the only surviving Japanese escort pilot, along with trajectory analysis of the bullet damage on the wreckage, officially credits Rex Barber with the kill. The United States Air Force ultimately split the credit in a 1993 ruling which satisfied neither pilot and resolved nothing. When you look at the evidence, both physical and eyewitness accounts favor Barber. The most direct surviving account from the Japanese perspective comes from Vice Admiral Ugaki, reconstructed years later and preserved in Agawa's biography. Ugaki, looking from the second Betty, spotted the P-38s climbing toward the lead plane. He gripped the shoulder of the staff officer sitting right beside him, pointing toward the commander-in-chief's plane. In an instant, it vanished, replaced by a massive column of black smoke rising from the trees. Ugaki's words, as recorded in the official account, boiled the entire tragedy down to a single sentence. Everything was over now. Ugaki kept a detailed war diary, an immense document maintained with strict daily discipline. It was published in English in 1991 under the title Fading Victory by the University of Pittsburgh Press. Edited by Donald Goldstein and Catherine Dillon, translated by Masataka Chihaya with a foreword by Gordon Prange. The diary spans the war from Pearl Harbor to the final days, yet contains a complete blank from mid-April 1943 to February 1944. This missing period covers Ugaki's long hospitalization and recovery. If he had any thoughts on how the Americans intercepted them so precisely, he chose not to write them down. Or, if he did, those specific pages were never released by his family or the archives holding the original manuscript. Once Ugaki resumed writing in 1944, during the brutal final 18 months of the war, his pages filled with operational frustrations, strategic realities, and increasingly dark reflections on Japan's losing battle. He documented crushing losses, key command decisions, and the decline of Japanese air strength, but never once returned to the question of the American ambush. He never asked how the Americans had obtained Yamamoto's exact flight itinerary. The tragedy that nearly took his life and killed his commander was treated simply as a physical wound to heal from, rather than a puzzle to solve. A Japanese search party, led by Lieutenant Hamasuna, hacked through the dense Bougainville jungle the very next morning. On April 19th, guided by the rising smoke column they had spotted the day before. The crash site lay deep in the tropical forest northwest of Bouin, where the Betty bomber had sheared through trees and shattered. Debris lay scattered across a wide area. Yamamoto's body was thrown clear of the wreck, found sitting upright in his seat under a tree, still wearing his green uniform, with a white-gloved hand resting on the hilt of his samurai sword and his head bowed forward as if asleep. The search party recorded this grim scene for command. A naval medical team conducted an autopsy on the spot, documenting 2 50-caliber bullet wounds, one piercing the back of his left shoulder, and another entering his lower left jaw before exiting above his right eye. The doctors concluded that the head wound was instantly fatal, sustained mid-air before the bomber ever hit the forest floor. All physical evidence proved that Yamamoto was killed by active gunfire during the aerial dogfight, rather than the crash itself. Ogawa later noted, through medical accounts and interviews with the original recovery team, that the published autopsy report was deliberately altered by high command to protect the public from the graphic reality of his wounds. Yamamoto's remains were quietly cremated at Bouin. Returned to Japan aboard the battleship Musashi, he was given a grand state funeral in Tokyo on June 5, 1943. This marked only the second time a Japanese naval officer received such an honor following Admiral Heihachiro Togo. Posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral, he also received the prestigious Grand Cordon of the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum. Yet the government kept his death a secret until May 21st, more than 5 weeks after the shootdown. While the combined fleet reorganized its leadership and managed the shock among the ranks, this delay was entirely deliberate. Yamamoto's name carried a massive weight in the public's mind, unmatched by any other wartime military leader. He was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the literal face of Japanese naval power in the public eye. Officials feared that sharing this news too soon would crush domestic morale, just as the war began turning against Japan. When they finally broke the silence, they wrapped it in a highly controlled story of heroic sacrifice in battle. Crucial details, the flight schedule, the weak escort, and especially the precise American ambush, were completely left out of public reports. The internal investigation stayed buried. But later, renowned American naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote about this, writing in his massive, multi-volume history of United States naval operations during the Second World War. He argued that losing Yamamoto was just as devastating to Japanese morale and strategy as losing a major fleet battle. Admiral Nimitz's staff completely agreed. After all, the mission was not planned as mere revenge for the Pearl Harbor strike, but as the deliberate elimination of the single Japanese commander, whom U.S. intelligence deemed capable of brilliant strategy under intense pressure. Meanwhile, inside Tokyo's command rooms, a terrifying question began circulating, one that nobody could answer. How did the enemy know? The Imperial Navy officially designated the loss as the Navy A incident. That cold bureaucratic label says a lot about how the military's leadership processed such a devastating blow. They did not treat it as a critical security breach, nor did they hand it to Codebreakers for review. Instead, they filed it as a routine operational loss, hidden behind bureaucratic walls. It was the language of an institution that trusted its own systems blindly, refusing to question them. The investigation, run by top officers in Tokyo, looked at a few possibilities. Subscribe as we examine their theories. Commander Watanabe's earlier warning about Army communications gave the investigators their most convenient scapegoat. The flight details, as Watanabe discovered to his horror after the ambush, had been transmitted over an Army radio channel using a code the Navy despised. The Army relied on an entirely different cipher, one the Navy believed was handled with sloppy discipline. If the Americans intercepted the schedule, investigators argued they did it through the weak Army system, not their own cipher. Their second theory focused on the Allied Coast Watcher network. Australian and New Zealand scouts were operating deep behind enemy lines across the Solomons, hiding in the jungles with portable radios to monitor Japanese ships and planes, sending intelligence back to Guadalcanal. If a scout near Rabaul had spotted Yamamoto preparing to leave, or even noticed the specific planes taking off that morning, that info could have reached U.S. controllers quickly enough to scramble fighters. Best of all, this theory meant their codes were still secure. A third explanation was pure coincidence. U.S. fighters had been patrolling Bougainville for months. Perhaps a routine sweep just crossed the Admiral's path at the worst possible second. Supporters of this theory downplayed the precise timing, but skeptics pointed out the highly improbable math involved. Of 16 American fighters arriving at the exact minute of his descent toward Balali, on a path that placed the attackers right between the bombers and the safety of the runway, after flying over 400 miles from Guadalcanal. Coincidence, they argued, could not explain such flawless geometry. Yet the fourth theory, the correct one, was never even considered. The terrifying reality that Washington had broken JN-25 and were reading fleet communications almost in real time was a truth the leadership refused to accept. The Codebreakers offered little help to the inquiry, delivering nothing but empty reassurances. They argued that the cipher key had changed just 12 days before the transmission. The new codes had not been active long enough for enemy analysts to spot patterns. Besides, they believed the complex Japanese language made decryption mathematically impossible. These reassuring excuses became the official consensus, but they were tragically detached from actual operational reality. By June 1942, the Americans had already anticipated Japan's moves at Midway, springing a lethal trap on a fleet they had mapped out with uncanny accuracy. Later, Tokyo's own investigators chalked this defeat up to basic scouting and aerial patrols, submarine tracks, and sheer luck, completely dismissing broken codes. Yet, as American forces kept anticipating Japanese moves in the Solomons during late 1942 and early 1943, showing up at the perfect time and place again and again, Japanese naval intelligence still refused to launch a formal investigation. They explained away every loss individually. No one stepped back to see the bigger picture. When officers brushed off the ambush of Admiral Yamamoto, they were just following a habit of ignoring truths their leaders simply could not accept. Astonishingly, nobody in Japan's high command suggested the most obvious test of all, actually trying to crack their own JN-25 cipher to prove it was truly unbreakable. Meanwhile, the Americans fed this confidence with continuous, clever deception. After the shootdown, American commanders kept sending P-38 patrols over the Bali and Bougainville areas, framing them as routine fighter sweeps. This coastal activity made the Yamamoto ambush look like a random chance encounter rather than a targeted hit based on decoded messages. The sweep pattern suggested that U.S. fighters had always patrolled the skies before April 18th and would keep doing so afterward, creating a quiet background of normalcy to mask the targeted strike. Washington maintained total silence, never acknowledging the admiral's death. The pilots themselves were told the tip came from Australian coast watchers near Rabaul, and most accepted that cover story without asking any questions. But rumors leaked. On the return flight, a captain bragged about the kill over open radio frequencies, using clear language that the Japanese easily could have intercepted, which absolutely infuriated U.S. military brass. Though the Navy originally recommended Major Mitchell for the Medal of Honor, historical records show the award faced a sudden setback. Angered by the reckless chatter, top brass downgraded his medal to the Navy Cross to keep the high-profile mission out of the spotlight. 6 months later, in October 1943, the secret nearly blew wide open when Time magazine published a detailed piece on the long-range mission, detailing the exact interception and timing, pointing directly to broken codes as the true source. U.S. security chiefs panicked. This leak mirrored a major 1942 scare when the Chicago Tribune implied that U.S. forces were reading Japanese codes before the Battle of Midway. That slip-up triggered a grand jury investigation, though no formal charges were ever filed. The 1943 Time article was less direct than the Tribune story, but posed the exact same danger. If Japanese intelligence connected the dots, the secret would be out. Yet Tokyo remained unconcerned. Officers who read the article kept blaming the ambush on local coast watchers, sloppy radio security, or just bad luck. Their belief in the absolute security of the JN-25 cipher was so deep that even a glaring leak in a major American magazine, read by millions in a nation where Japanese spies still operated through neutral capitals, failed to spark any investigation. The Codebreakers were never asked to re-examine their security, and the Navy A incident file remained closed. The cipher went unchanged, and the inquiry stayed shut. If you want to keep exploring these historical archives, hit that subscribe button to get our next case file delivered straight to your feed. Returning to what Tokyo chose to ignore, the post-war archives are just as shocking for what they hide as what they reveal. Take Captain Yasuji Watanabe, the man who actually wrote and transmitted that fatal travel itinerary. On October 15, 1945, U.S. Navy Captain Shands interrogated him in Tokyo for the official Strategic Bombing Survey, documented as Interrogation Number 96. Watanabe had risen in rank during the war and spoke perfect English. Watanabe answered inquiries about Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway, and the Solomon Islands campaign with professional honesty throughout the grueling session. The published transcript runs for dozens of pages, yet you won't find one question about the Yamamoto shootdown. They did not ask a single question about Cipher security, nor did they mention the Navy A incident. This omission was no accident. By October 1945, 6 weeks after the surrender, American intelligence still actively hid that JN-25 was broken. While Japanese officers were being debriefed across the Pacific, a serious concern grew within the intelligence community. An Associated Press account on September 10, 1945 warned that if officers discovered the code breaking, they might retreat into shame or silence before they could be fully questioned. The code-breaking origin of the Yamamoto mission wasn't publicly confirmed until that article on September 10th, 5 months after Germany's surrender and a solid month after Japan's. Even then, American intelligence wanted this disclosure delayed even further because they were still extracting vital military secrets from officers who never realized how thoroughly they were being read. Watanabe's only comment during his interrogation regarding wartime secrecy was a simple, passing observation made without any realization of its deep personal irony. The Japanese people, he told his American interrogator, are not trained to keep secrets, meaning top-level government information was routinely leaked. He was unknowingly describing his own exact role in the tragedy. But the irony ran far deeper than Watanabe's individual situation. The American officers sitting opposite him in that October session had absolute proof that the flight itinerary Watanabe drafted 18 months prior had been intercepted, translated, and acted upon within hours of its transmission. They knew exactly which Allied cryptanalysts had cracked the code. They knew the entire chain of command that authorized the deadly airstrike. They held the official translation in their files. Yet they asked Watanabe nothing, because in October 1945, the secret of JN-25 was worth far more than any answers he could give. The code-breaking capability that sealed Yamamoto's fate was the very same power that secured the American victory at Midway, that directed deadly submarine attacks against Japanese shipping throughout 1943 and 1944, and positioned Allied fleets at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Revealing this to any Japanese officer, even a cooperative veteran, threatened to compromise the secret methods and knowledge that American intelligence needed to safeguard for the post-war era. If we look at the most reliable post-war assessment of what Japan understood, it came from Otis Carey, a United States Navy lieutenant, raised in Japan by missionary parents who spoke the language with perfect native fluency. Carey interrogated high-ranking Imperial Japanese Navy officers post-surrender, writing reports still studied today. Remember to subscribe and like for more history. His conclusions, later cited in Admiral Leighton's memoirs and by other historians, proved that Japanese naval officers apparently never seriously considered the terrifying possibility that the Americans were reading their secret codes. Not after Yamamoto's plane was shot down, nor after the American foreknowledge at Midway, and not after a relentless wave of American victories in the Solomons that pointed to detailed intelligence far beyond what scouts or aerial reconnaissance could deliver. Their belief that the complex Japanese language was an impenetrable shield beneath their codes was so deeply ingrained in their military culture that no amount of evidence could ever shatter it. In his 1995 book, Combined Fleet Decoded, historian John Prados argued this was not mere laziness, but a fatal failure to self-assess. The Imperial Navy's code specialists never ran an adversarial check on JN-25. They never formed an internal red team where their very best codebreakers would try to crack the encryption from the outside and report honestly on what they discovered. Instead, they took code security for granted, with no official system in place to challenge that belief. Prados highlighted a deep cultural bias, claiming that the Japanese believed Westerners could never decode their complex language fast enough for real-time military intelligence, which only fed their complacency, creating a double barrier of false confidence that made them completely blind to their own fatal security flaws. As we now know, the Americans took extreme care to protect this Japanese overconfidence, protecting their adversary's blind spot as fiercely as they guarded the intercepted secrets themselves. The JN-25 decode system was never rebuilt after Yamamoto's death. It was simply updated with new codebooks. Though its basic architecture was never fundamentally redesigned, it kept providing readable communications to American intelligence for the rest of the Pacific War. The exact same cipher that exposed Yamamoto's fatal itinerary carried fleet locations, convoy routes, and submarine patrol paths, and tactical orders through the massive carrier clashes of 1944, through the Philippines campaign, and through the final desperate months of defending Okinawa. U.S. commanders from Spruance to Halsey to Nimitz himself used this cracked code to position their fleets with a regularity that the Japanese attributed to superior scout planes, to sheer luck, or to the overwhelming scale of Allied forces, literally anything other than the one reality that would force them to question their code experts. Every false assumption the Japanese Navy held about its radio security in April 1943 remained entirely unchallenged and unchanged by August 1945. That crash over Bougainville cost the Japanese Navy far more than its most senior officer. It took away the single commander who had truly measured the depth of American industrial power firsthand, the man who had walked through U.S. shipyards, oil refineries, and aircraft plants with his own eyes, fully understanding in private what he could never admit publicly, that Japan could never win a prolonged war against the United States. Admiral Manechi Koga, who succeeded Yamamoto as fleet commander, was judged by U.S. planners as a far more cautious, less imaginative, and less dangerous adversary. Intelligence officer Leighton had argued this exact point when urging the strike. Yet Koga himself was killed less than a year later, on March 31st, 1944, when his plane vanished in a typhoon during a flight from Palau. The Japanese called this setback the Navy B incident. Koga's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, survived the crash only to be captured by Filipino guerrillas, along with Japan's entire defensive strategy for the Central Pacific, the vital blueprint the Americans called the Z Plan. It was another catastrophic security failure, a trove of operational secrets spilling into Allied hands simply because the High Command refused to re-examine their assumptions. You and I can see why this pattern persisted. Their institutional reflex was always to blame anything rather than face the real truth. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, the survivor of the second bomber crash on April 18, 1943, recovered from his wounds over the next year. He returned to command, and by 1945 led the 5th Air Fleet from Kyushu, launching devastating kamikaze attacks against the Allied ships off Okinawa. Over the course of that final year, Ugaki watched the Allies dismantle Japan's defensive line with a ruthless precision that pointed to intelligence far deeper than simple scout flights or submarine reports. He wrote down these mounting frustrations in his diary, often with extreme bitterness, yet he never connected the dots to the reality that American codebreakers were handing Allied commanders a clear, ongoing picture of Japanese locations, plans, and movements. On August 15, 1945, just hours after Emperor Hirohito broadcast the surrender terms, Ugaki stripped off his rank insignia, climbed into the back of a Yokosuka dive bomber at Oita Airfield, leading one last unauthorized kamikaze mission toward Okinawa. His final diary entry, penned minutes before taking off, declared his intention to follow Yamamoto into death. His plane was never officially confirmed to have hit any target. If you and I read his diary today, published 46 years later, we see it ends with those exact words written before takeoff. He never once wrote in any surviving entry that he suspected the Americans had actually cracked their code. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto served as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet from August 1939 until his death on April 18, 1943, at 59 years old. He was posthumously promoted to Marshal Admiral and awarded the nation's highest honor, the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, the very staff officer who transmitted the itinerary that sealed his fate, survived the war, sitting across from U.S. interrogators who already knew exactly what that message had done and never spoke a word of it. Marine officer Alva Lasswell and the brilliant cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor broke that intercepted message in less than 24 hours. That original American translation still exists today within the archives of the National Security Agency. The original Japanese 5-digit code blocks from that transmission are either classified or destroyed. The official Japanese investigation file on this historic air ambush has never been fully published in any language. If this chapter of history matters to you, hit that like button to keep these records from vanishing into the noise. Hit subscribe and our next historical file will find you. During World War II, sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy sent their secret orders in code, fully trusting those ciphers to guard their words. But the Codebreakers who shattered that cipher read every word in quiet secrecy, a silence that lasted for decades. Yet, both records survived.